Welcome to another deep dive. Today's going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
We've got a documentary, news reports, court documents,
A lot of material.
all about the murder of Robert Schwartz,
Right.
a renowned DNA scientist, and the conviction of his daughter Clara for orchestrating his murder.
It's got all the makings of a true crime thriller, doesn't it?
It really does.
Role-playing games,
Yeah.
web of teenage relationships,
Uh-huh.
and then this brutal murder.
Yeah, and speaking of brutal, the crime scene itself was pretty horrific.
Oh, yeah.
December 2001, a Virginia farmhouse.
Oh.
Robert Schwartz found dead.
Multiple stab wounds.
Multiple stab wounds,
Ah.
and X carved into his neck.
Oh, wow.
So people immediately started speculating about ritualistic killings.
Right. And the timing also didn't help.
Yeah.
I mean, this was shortly after the anthrax scare, and there had been other mysterious deaths of scientists. So the public was primed for conspiracy theories.
Yeah, were these events actually connected
Uh-huh.
or just a series of coincidences?
Yeah. It's a question a lot of people were asking.
Well, let's dive into the details.
Okay.
Initially, the focus was on these three teenagers who were close friends with Clara.
Right.
Michael P. Fall, his girlfriend Catherine English, and then Kyle Holbert.
Okay.
They were all part of this, let's just say, unique social circle.
A little bit on the fringes, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the investigation quickly shifted gears.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they found some inconsistencies in Clara's statements to the police,
Uh-huh.
coupled with some new evidence, and it really started to paint a different picture.
So you're saying that this wasn't just teenage drama? This
Yeah.
was a calculated plot
Yeah,
to eliminate her father.
that's what it looks like.
Wow. Are you saying that Claire, this teenager, was the mastermind behind her own father's murder?
The evidence seems to point in that direction.
Okay.
I mean, we've got these coded emails and instant messages where she's openly expressing her desire to have her father killed.
Wow.
And she's even trying to hire someone to do it.
She was actually trying to hire a hitman.
It seems that way.
That's incredible.
And it's all there in black and white, this digital trail leading right back to her.
But now there's also this Underworld role-playing game that was a huge part of Clara's life.
Right.
This wasn't just some casual board game. This seems to have really blurred the lines
It did.
between fantasy and reality for them.
Yeah, it really did.
So tell me about this game.
So imagine a world where magic and dragons and assassins are not just concepts,
Okay.
but actual beliefs.
Wow.
And in this game, there was a character called the Assassin, and he was played by a guy named Patrick House.
Okay.
And get this, Clara actually approached him in real life
Oh.
and asked him to kill her father.
Wait a minute. She tried to hire her in-game assassin to commit a real-life murder?
Apparently so.
That is unbelievable. What did he say?
Well, to his credit, he realized she was serious and he refused.
Right.
And he actually ended up becoming a key witness for the prosecution.
Wow.
Yeah, providing some really crucial insights into Clara's state of mind.
But the person who actually committed the murder was Kyle Holbert.
Right.
And his motivation seemed to be this really tangled mix of mental illness,
Yeah.
manipulation, and then this dangerous fascination with fantasy.
Absolutely. A really complex individual.
Okay, let's talk about Holbert for a second. You mentioned mental illness.
Yes.
What exactly were his struggles?
He had a long history of pretty severe mental health challenges,
Okay.
including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
He had been institutionalized multiple times.
Mhm.
And like Clara, he was really drawn to these fantasy worlds.
Right.
And this made him particularly susceptible to manipulation.
So Clara used Holbert's mental state
It seems that way.
and his love of fantasy to convince him to kill her father.
Yeah.
How did she manage that? What was her motive?
Well, according to Holbert, Clara told him that her father was abusive
Okay.
and that he needed to be stopped.
Right.
Now, whether this was true or a fabrication to manipulate Holbert
Yeah.
remains a point of contention in this case. But one thing is certain, Holbert believed he was acting as a protector,
Oh, wow.
a hero saving Clara from this terrible threat.
It's kind of a classic hero narrative, isn't it?
You could say that.
You know, saving the damsel in distress.
Exactly.
And to think that this all stemmed from a role-playing game
Right.
where these lines between fantasy and reality became so dangerously blurred.
Yeah, it's a chilling example of how immersion in a fantasy world,
Uh-huh.
especially for someone with pre-existing mental health conditions,
Yeah.
can have really, really dangerous consequences.
And in this case,
Deadly.
deadly consequences. But what's really disturbing is the level of premeditation
Right.
that we're seeing here. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment act of passion.
No.
Clara had planned this for some time.
She had.
Really?
Yeah, remember those coded emails and messages?
Yeah.
They weren't just about expressing a desire, they actually contained specific plans.
Wow.
Yeah, and she even sent money to Holbert.
Right.
For gas gloves a disguise.
She was really serious about this.
She-
And Holbert, in his delusional state,
Right.
was willing to carry out this plan.
It seems so.
It's a horrifying thought. And remember that X carved into Robert Schwartz's neck.
Yes.
That detail that seems so ritualistic
Yeah.
was actually Holbert's attempt to mark the kill.
Right, like something out of a video game.
Exactly like he was playing his character.
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
So this just keeps getting darker and darker. What happened next? Did Holbert confess?
He did. He actually wrote this chilling 7-page confession
Wow.
detailing the whole murder.
Okay.
He described the sword he used,
Uh-huh.
and even the moment when Schwartz, in his final moments, asked Holbert, "What did I ever do to you?"
Oh, my God.
It's a really heartbreaking scene that just shows the stark contrast between Holbert's delusion
Right.
and the brutal reality of his actions.
It really does make you wonder what was going through Holbert's mind in that moment.
Right.
Did he truly believe he was doing the right thing?
Yeah.
Or did the reality of what he had done finally hit him?
It's impossible to know for sure.
Yeah.
But his confession gives us a little glimpse into his psyche.
Okay.
He talks about feeling like a protector,
Huh?
drawn to Clara's vulnerability,
Right.
and convinced by her claims of abuse.
Right.
So he saw himself as this hero.
A knight in shining armor,
Exactly.
saving her from a perceived threat.
That's right.
It's just such a tragic example of how mental illness, coupled with this manipulation,
Yes.
can lead to such devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
But what about the others involved, Fall and English?
Right.
What were their roles in all of this?
That's where things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Fall, the one who drove Holbert to Schwartz's house that night,
Right.
claimed he didn't know what Holbert was planning.
Really?
Yeah, he even called his participation a big oopsie,
A big oopsie.
which is such a strange thing to say.
I know, it's so casual considering the gravity of the situation.
Exactly.
So it really raises questions about his level of awareness and culpability.
It's-
What about English?
Well, English, who was also present that night, agreed to testify against Clara and the others
Oh, wow.
in exchange for a lighter sentence.
Okay.
So her testimony gave some valuable insight into the group dynamics
Ah,
and corroborated Holbert's claims about Clara's accusations of abuse.
okay.
But it's important to remember that she also had a motive to portray Clara in a negative light.
Right, to save herself.
Exactly.
So we've got this really complex web of manipulation, delusion, and varying degrees of culpability.
We do.
What happened next? Did they all go to trial?
They did, and that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
I can't wait to hear what happens.
You and me both.
This is already more twists and turns than I anticipated.
Yeah, this case is full of surprises.
We'll be right back with part 2, where we'll delve into the trials, the verdicts, and all the lingering questions surrounding this truly bizarre case.
It's a wild one.
It really is.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
Now, we left off on quite the cliffhanger.
We did.
Waiting to hear about the trials. So we have these 4 people caught up in this mess,
Right.
all facing their own reckoning. I guess you could say it's almost like a Shakespearean tragedy.
You
The
could.
DNA scientist,
Right.
his manipulative daughter, the vulnerable young man caught in the middle, and then the friends who either enabled the crime or tried to distance themselves from it.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating dynamic between all of them.
So let's start with Clara's trial.
Okay.
She was the alleged mastermind,
Right.
right? What was her defense strategy?
Well, the defense definitely had their work cut out for them.
I bet.
Remember Patrick House, the assassin from the Underworld game?
Uh-huh.
He actually became a key witness for the prosecution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he testified that Clara had repeatedly asked him to kill her father.
So she tried to hire someone else before turning to Holbert.
She did, and it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
She actually referred to her father as old guy in their game-related messages.
So they were already using this kind of code
It seems that way.
to talk about this.
Yeah, it really painted a disturbing picture of her intent.
So did they present any evidence of this?
Oh, yeah, they had a mountain of evidence.
Like what?
Well, they had those coded emails and instant messages where she's using terms like te for murder
Wow.
and OG for her father.
It's so casual.
It is, and it's not just talk. They also showed evidence that she sent Holbert money.
Before.
For gas gloves, a disguise, all very meticulously planned out.
It really sounds like the prosecution had a very strong case.
Oh, they did.
So how did the defense even try to counter that?
Well, they tried to portray Clara as this troubled teenager who was deeply immersed in this fantasy world of the game and desperate to escape a difficult home life.
So they were basically saying that she was all talk, no action.
That's right. They argued that she never intended for Holbert to actually carry out the murder.
Right.
She was just venting her frustrations.
Okay. Did they present any evidence to support that claim?
They did. They brought in witnesses who testified about the strained relationship between Clara and her father, and some even described instances of verbal abuse and neglect.
So painting a picture of a young woman struggling to cope with this really difficult family situation.
Exactly.
So if there was all this tension between Clara and her father, could that have influenced her actions?
Well, that's what the defense argued.
Okay.
They said that she was overwhelmed by her circumstances and she sought solace in this world of fantasy.
Oh.
And her words, while disturbing, were never meant to be taken literally.
So they were trying to create reasonable doubt about her intent. Did it work?
The jury deliberated for days.
Wow.
But in the end, they found Clara guilty of first-degree murder.
Wow. That must have been a shock.
The verdict really sent shockwaves through the community.
I bet.
Some people were outraged.
Yeah.
Others felt a sense of sympathy for this troubled young woman.
It's hard to imagine being in that courtroom.
It is.
And hearing that verdict. What was her sentence?
She was sentenced to 48 years in prison.
48 years. That's a long time.
The judge acknowledged the complexities of the case.
But ultimately held her accountable for her actions.
And emphasized the premeditation and the manipulation of a vulnerable person.
Exactly.
What about the others? Holbert, Fall, and English. What were their fates?
Well, Holbert, the one who actually confessed to the murder,
Right.
pleaded guilty to first-degree murder.
Okay.
And his sentencing hearing was really something.
What do you mean?
It really gave us this glimpse
Yeah.
into his motivations and his relationship with Clara. He talked about feeling like her protector.
Okay.
And he was convinced that he was acting heroically.
So he really believed it. He did. He was living in this world where fantasy and reality were just completely intertwined.
It makes you wonder, what if he hadn't met Clara?
Right.
If he had been pulled into this whole thing?
Yeah. Would he have ended up on this path? It's a question we can't really answer.
That's true. What was his sentence?
He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
Wow.
Given the severity of the crime and his confession, it was a harsh sentence. But it reflected the gravity of what he did.
And what about Fall in English?
Right. Well, Fall,
Yeah.
who drove Holbert to Schwartz's house,
Yeah.
pleaded guilty to second-degree murder.
Okay.
And his statement to the court was this really bizarre mix of remorse and then the strange lack of awareness.
What do you mean?
Well, he apologized to Robert Schwartz.
Okay.
And he asked for a sign that he was well.
That's a very strange request.
It is. It's almost like he couldn't grasp the reality of what had happened.
Yeah.
The permanence of it all.
It's unsettling.
It is.
What was his sentence?
He was sentenced to over 21 years in prison.
Wow.
The judge, while acknowledging his lesser role in the crime, still emphasized the seriousness of his actions.
And lastly, we have Catherine English.
Right.
She was the one who testified against everyone.
She agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a lighter sentence.
Right.
She testified about these conversations she witnessed between Clara and Holbert. And she really detailed those accusations of abuse and Clara's desire to have her father killed.
So her testimony was crucial.
It was.
In corroborating Holbert's account.
Yes, and establishing Clara's intent.
What was her sentence?
She received a 12-month sentence.
Oh, only 12 months.
Some people argued that it was too lenient.
I bet.
But the prosecution maintained that her cooperation was instrumental in getting those convictions.
So we have these 4 individuals,
right,
all facing consequences for their actions.
Yeah, some more severe than others.
It's interesting how the justice system works in these cases.
It is.
Where you have multiple people involved with these varying degrees of culpability.
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions about fairness and accountability.
It really does.
Oh,
but
yeah.
What about the victim in all of this?
Right.
Robert Schwartz.
Right.
What was his story? What kind of man was he?
Well, that's perhaps the most tragic part of this whole story.
Okay.
Robert Schwartz was a renowned DNA scientist,
Right.
a man dedicated to his work, and by all accounts, a loving father. But the trial revealed a more complicated picture.
Really?
A man who may have been struggling with some personal demons.
Yeah.
A father who perhaps wasn't as perfect as he seemed.
It sounds like there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
There are.
About him, about his relationship with his daughter, about the truth behind those abuse allegations.
It's a reminder that even in these really horrific crimes, there are often shades of gray complexities that we can't fully understand.
It's true. This case isn't just about the murder itself.
No.
It's about all the people involved, their motivations, their flaws, and then these tragic consequences that came about when fantasy and reality collided.
Absolutely. It's a story about human nature.
It really is. It's been a fascinating and disturbing journey through this case.
It has.
We've explored the evidence, the psychology, the legal battles, and these bigger societal implications. But in the end, we're still left with this sense of tragedy.
We are.
A man lost his life.
Right.
A young woman threw away her future, and a troubled young man became a pawn in this deadly game.
It's a reminder of the fragility of life.
Yes.
The destructive power of deceit.
Yeah.
And how important it is to recognize those warning signs.
Of manipulation.
Yes.
And mental distress.
Exactly.
This case has really given us a lot to think about.
It has.
It's a story that stays with you. And it makes you question your own perceptions.
It does.
And consider the things that shape our choices and our destinies.
That's right.
It also serves as a cautionary tale.
In a way.
Urging us to be mindful of the stories we tell ourselves.
Right.
In the digital worlds that we inhabit.
Right.
And to remember that actions have consequences.
Even in fantasy.
Even fantasy.
That's a powerful thought to end on.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Robert Schwartz murder case. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Robert Schwartz murder case. And, you know, we've really gone through a lot.
Yeah, we have.
You've taken us through all this evidence, the psychology, the legal battles, but we're not done yet.
Not quite. This case really went beyond the courtroom.
It did.
And it raised these questions about role-playing games.
Yeah.
And that fine line between fantasy and reality.
Exactly. And it really became this focal point for a lot of people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for discussions about escapism and its potential dangers.
Especially within the gaming community.
Right. Some people argued that role-playing games, particularly the ones with dark or violent themes, could desensitize players to real-world violence.
That's a pretty serious claim.
It is.
Did this case actually change anything within the gaming community?
Well, it definitely sparked a lot of debate
Okay.
and introspection, I think. You know, game developers, players, even psychologists all weighed in on the issue.
It became a big conversation.
It did, and some people argued that games, like any form of media, can influence behavior. Especially in individuals who are already predisposed to violence.
Right.
Or have difficulty separating fantasy from reality.
So it's not so much blaming the games themselves, but understanding they can be a factor.
Yeah, one factor among many.
Yeah, in this complex situation.
Exactly.
What about the ethical questions that this case raised?
Right.
You know, we talked about the plea deals, the different levels of accountability.
Yeah, it really fueled discussions about the ethics of plea bargaining, especially in cases where you have people with different levels of involvement getting vastly different sentences.
So, for example...
Well, some people argued that Catherine English...
Okay, the one who helped cover up the crime.
Yeah, got off too lightly.
Right.
While others said, no, her cooperation was essential.
Yeah, to get those convictions.
Exactly. So it's this really tricky balance.
Yeah, you're trying to make sure that justice is served.
Right.
But you also have to think about...
complexities.
Yeah, all those individual circumstances.
Absolutely. This case really highlights those gray areas.
It does. And it also makes you think about the role of mental illness in criminal justice.
It does, and it also makes you think about the role of mental illness in criminal justice.
It does. Kyle Holbert's case in particular.
Right. Really sparked a lot of debate about how the legal system should deal with people who have severe mental health challenges.
Well, and they commit crimes.
Yeah, so the question is, should they be held fully accountable?
Right.
Or should their mental state be taken into consideration?
As a mitigating factor?
Exactly. It's a really tough question.
With no easy answers.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a reminder that the justice system is always trying to be fair, but it has to deal with these nuances.
Right.
The human behavior and the complexities of mental health.
Absolutely. And I think this case is a good example of those broader societal issues.
You know, the ones that we don't really like to talk about?
Right, those blurred lines between fantasy and reality.
The manipulation.
The manipulation, yeah, and just the challenges of balancing justice with compassion.
This has been such a fascinating journey.
It has.
And at times disturbing.
Yes.
You know, we've explored so much.
We have.
But I think in the end, we're still left with this feeling of just tragedy.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable.
You know, a man lost his life. A young woman threw away her future, and then this troubled young man was just a pawn in this really messed up game.
It's heartbreaking, and I think it's a reminder for all of us.
About what?
About how fragile life is.
Yeah.
And just how destructive deceit can be.
It's a powerful message.
It is, and we should all be aware of those warning signs, you know?
The manipulation.
This mental distress.
Exactly. Those things can have such a ripple effect.
Yeah, you've really given us a lot to think about.
I'm glad to hear that.
You know, it's a story that sticks with you.
Uh-huh.
And it makes you question everything.
It does.
You know, your perceptions, the things that shape our choices, and ultimately our destinies.
Yeah. I think that's the power of these kinds of stories.
They make you look inward.
They do. And I think this one also serves as a cautionary tale.
Oh, how so?
Well, it makes us think about the stories that we create in our own minds.
Right.
And in those digital worlds that we're all a part of.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that actions have consequences.
Even in those fantasy worlds. Especially in those fantasy worlds sometimes.
Wow. That's a powerful thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Robert Schwartz murder case.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.